Good morning, everyone, and welcome to MTPConnect's seminar on the frontiers of biomechanics and human movement. My name's Kate Brooks, and I'm based here in WA in Perth. So once again, welcome if you are joining us from wherever you are in Australia and across the world. As we gather for this meeting, physically dispersed and virtually constructed, let's take a moment to reflect the meaning of place, and doing so, recognise the various traditional lands on which we do our business today. We acknowledge the elders, past, present and emerging, of all the land we work and live on, and their ancestral spirits with gratitude and respect. Today's seminar will run for 1 hour. We have 4 fantastic speakers to talk to you today and share their insights on human movement and biomechanics. I'm going to introduce everyone shortly, and I'll be asking the panel speakers some questions, and then we'll take questions from you. So please type in those questions on the Q&A session box. It's a good place to be right now in Perth, and my thoughts are with all of you who are calling in from wherever you might be, with some restrictions placed on you and your families. And I'm really grateful that you could join us this morning for this 1 hour of very exciting conversation. So let's get started. MTPConnect's 2020 Sector Competitiveness Plan outlines human movement and sports science as an emerging knowledge priority in Australia. That as the digital evolution drives the growth of new digital technologies, there is a revolution underway in the field of biomechanics that could impact well-being and healthy aging. For the next hour, we're going to explore the innovations from this sector, including the latest developments in wearable sensors, data analytics, augmented ability and their applications in high performance sport, workplace injury prevention, well-being and rehabilitation. Joining us today are Associate Professor Jacqueline Alderson from the University of Western Australia, a leading sports scientist working with elite sporting teams for over 20 years. Jacqueline will talk about developing the digital twin model that uses artificial intelligence to improve an athlete's performance by enabling researchers to perform real-time monitoring of a person's health data and test scenarios on the data collected. Next, we have Lee Walsh from Rick Wingfield from Catapult Sports. Catapult develops wearable technologies to address fundamental questions in athletes' performance management and details analysis. Chief Technology Officer Rick will discuss the potential of the development of integrated technologies that have had a proven track record of delivering innovation and digital transformation. And he's going to share with us his experience in this space from his work with major organisations such as Barclays, AAA, NAB, and Australia Post. Platypus Technical Design Solutions performs data and analysis and specialises in applying international research knowledge and best practice to improving health and performance. The Director and Principal, Dr. Lee Walsh, will discuss with us his experience as an engineer and medical scientist in policy and regulation in medical devices and cybersecurity. So I'm really excited to have all 3 of you here today on this virtual panel. And we'll of course be joined by our MTPConnect Managing Director and CEO, Dr. Dan Grant.
Thanks, Kate. So as Kate mentioned, my name is Dan Grant. I'm the Managing Director and CEO of MTPConnect, and it's great that you've all joined us today for our webinar. For those of you who don't know MTPConnect, we're the industry growth center for the medtech, biotech, and pharmaceutical sector. We were established in 2015 as part of a federal government initiative designed to help promote and accelerate the growth of specific industry sectors. We focus on the medtech, biotech, and pharmaceutical sector, including the digital health sector. As an organization, we function at the nexus of industry, of researchers, industry associations, governments, universities, investors, and regulators, with the real focus of accelerating the growth of the sector to ensure that we have improved patient outcomes, improved job growth, and economic return for the country. Our organization really focuses on 4 objectives: promoting the commercialization and collaboration within the sector, improving management workforce skills, driving access to global supply chains and markets, and optimizing regulatory environments. And as Kate mentioned earlier, each year we publish a sector competitiveness plan, which is a guide to the sector and its growth. This year we published our plan, and it highlighted how strong our medtech and biotech pharma sector was in Australia. It was a snapshot right up to the beginning of 2020. Fast forward 6 months, and of course we've all been impacted by COVID, and many parts of the sector have been impacted positively, but other parts of the sector have been impacted negatively. And you can see our report on the impact of COVID and the MTP sector by going to our website. Our sector competitiveness plan not only highlights the growth of the sector, which has been substantial over the last 5 years, but also sets out and comments on the mega trends that exist within the sector. And many of those mega trends, including the impact of the burden of chronic disease, the impact of precision healthcare, the movement towards value-based healthcare, healthy aging, consumer control, all of these mega trends directly connect to biomechanics and human movement. So I'm interested in learning more today from our panelists about how the sector is changing in these areas. One of the key things that our sector competitiveness plan does is to really identify knowledge priorities. These are priority areas that are intended to provide a strategic focus to the sector's activities. They represent areas where there's a high level of unmet need globally and where Australia is or has the potential to be a leading contributor. It's intended that these knowledge priorities help guide the growth and investment within the sector towards these areas. And we've been fortunate to work with LEK Consulting to revise these knowledge priorities each year. In 2019 and again in 2020, a number of emerging knowledge priorities were identified, and these included regenerative medicine, medical physiology, medical biotechnology, nanotechnology, and pain management, and optometry and ophthalmology. But important for today's discussion, human movement and sports science also emerged as a new emerging knowledge priority. Human movement and sports science was classified as an emerging priority because of its strong presence in terms of high quality of publications in Australia, ranking 4th in the world in this area. But intriguingly, this area in Australia has not attracted as much national competitive grant funding in recent years as perhaps this level of expertise might suggest would be the case. And so it's our intent over the years to come to help promote the emerging knowledge priorities. And today we're really excited to talk more about one of those, which is biomechanics, human movement. And again, look forward to the discussion we have with each of our panelists. Thanks, Kate.
Thank you, Dan. And if you're just joining us late, that's great. Welcome to MTPConnect seminar on the frontiers of biomechanics and human movement. We've just had a welcome from our MTPConnect CEO and Managing Director, Dr. Dan Grant. And I will just quickly reintroduce to you our 3 panel speakers that we have lined up for you today. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Associate Professor Jacqueline Alderson from the University of Western Australia, one of Australia's leading sports scientists working with elite sporting teams for over 20 years. We also have Chief Technology Officer of Catapult Sports, Rick Wingfield, and who Catapult Sports is using wearable technologies to address fundamental questions in athletes' performance, management, and detailed analysis. And also a big welcome to Director and Principal of Platypus Technical, Dr. Lee Walsh, Platypus Technical Design Solutions, performs data and analysis and specialises in applying international research knowledge and best practice to improving health performance. Welcome all of you today. Now what we're going to do for the next few minutes is to ask all our panelists to introduce themselves and talk about the work they're focusing on, and then we'll open up some questions from the floor. So please, you can start putting your questions on our Q&A panel, and I'll make note of them and we'll try and grab them for later on in the hour. Okay, I just first of all like to welcome Rick. If you could please tell us about your work with Catapult Sports.
Yeah, thanks, Kate, and thanks, Dan, for the welcome. So, as you mentioned, I'm the Chief Technology Officer at Catapult Sports. I will put a disclaimer in there early that I'm not a sports scientist. We've got some incredibly talented sports scientists on our team that I work with, but I'm really coming at it from the technical and product perspective. And we create technology to help athletes and teams perform to their true potential. We work with over 3,000 teams around the world, including in the top leagues like the NFL, the NBA, and the English Premier League. And here in Australia, we work with the AFL, the NRL, and Rugby Australia, and we've got very deep partnerships with those leagues, as you would expect from an Australian company. Catapult was invented, we invented team-based athlete tracking in 1999, prior to the 2000 Olympics, in a partnership between the Australian Institute of Sport and Cooperative Research Centre. So we do have a heritage in research, and it's a really interesting history to think about the commercialization of those early GPS trackers, which were being, which were pretty big at the time, that were being worn by athletes in the run up to the Sydney Olympics. We were founded as an independent company in 2006, and now we work, as I said, with over 3,000 teams around the world. We're really trying to solve the problem of quantifying the total workload on an athlete, so that performance practitioners can dynamically plan their training sessions and their pre-seasons and understand the base performance, and then really measure from that. In terms of some of the interesting frontiers, the things that we're looking at and things that we're exploring, I think on the wearable side, sensors are getting smaller and smaller. They're finding their way into garments. There was a release last year of a Nike shoe that was a smart shoe that had a lot of sensors in it. There are shirts that can measure heart rate and breathing. There are shorts that can track muscle activity. In the last year, we launched our own core heart rate vest, which was allowed an athlete to wear a much more comfortable ECG heart rate monitor that was really integrated into a garment. And so, in terms of one of the frontiers that we're looking at in the wearable space, it's really around the miniaturization of devices. The second frontier, I guess, we're interested in is video. So we have a lot of video solutions that are used by teams. And what we're seeing with advances in computer vision, and advances in high definition video, so 4K and maybe even 8K video, the ability to track and detect events at the moment, such as kicks and tackles in sport, is really interesting. But at the kind of frontiers, you can now do pose detection, and so you can get a lot of information in a quite an unobtrusive way. And so that's probably another frontier we're exploring. And the final one I'll mention is just really around data. We really do think of ourselves as a data company. We collect vast amounts of data about professional athletes, and advances in machine learning and AI are really making it much easier to analyze those vast amounts of data. And recently we've created we've been able to create, as a result of that, much more sophisticated analytics. So for example, one of the things we've done recently is looked at movement patterns of athletes based on inertial data at low speeds. We know that GPS tracking is really good at quantifying load on athletes at high speeds, but when you get down to low speeds, you need a much more sophisticated way of doing it. And we've invested in building some specific analytics that are based on specific movement patterns in specific sports to help quantify some of that low speed load that is not captured by pure, positional tracking. So those are some of the things that we're working on. It's an incredibly exciting field, and I look forward to being part of the panel today.
Thanks, Rick. That's great. And also you're touching on some of those really cool tech around miniaturization of devices and data analytics. And I'm sure our next speaker, Jack, can talk more about the exciting work that she's doing with that as well.
Thanks very much, Kate, and also to the MTPConnect team for the invite to talk today. I'll take a little bit of a historical step back just to clarify where I've come from. Clearly, I'm an academic at the University of WA, and I work in, or undertake both teaching and research here at the university in biomechanics, which is essentially an interdisciplinary field, and it's a relatively emerging field with respect to the sciences more generally. But for those of you who would like a definition, which many people often do, it's essentially a field that applies the principles of physics and mechanical laws to biological systems, and that enables us to understand how living organisms like humans and animals, etc., move and interact with their surroundings. I've been very lucky to be able to do what I love here at UWA for just under 2 decades now. And during that time, I've worked across both the clinical, so the medical sphere, certainly early in my career, and more recently have been more dedicated to sports biomechanics. So that means I've historically used biomechanics to do things like assist surgeons to make decisions about appropriate surgical intervention in things like cerebral palsy, help prosthetists to make prosthetic limbs for people, to optimise their function, deep brain stimulation in Parkinson's, in people with Parkinson's disease or essential tremor, where we've done things like individualise their frequency in electrodes from the electrode implant down in the lab to personalise that to patient the day after they've had DBS surgery and before the electrodes have been internalised in terms of a permanent setting like a pacemaker, etc. But also more recently, and probably what we're most well known for here at UWA, is our work in sports biomechanics, where we develop and test biomechanical models used to either analyse sporting motion like chucking in cricket, which is possibly what we're most well known for and what I've received the most number of inappropriate emails about, but also to do things like assess knee loading that might lead to ACL injuries in athletes, etc. We've worked with a vast array of sports, and I won't really go into them, possibly more sports than I'd even like to admit, because it makes me somewhat of a jack of all trades. But in some ways, I've been very lucky to step into a group here at UWA that's one of the first was the first sports biomech lab in Australia, but also one of the very first in the world. And that means, we've had a long and lovely relationship with Vicon motion capture systems that dates back to the early 80s, which means we have over 30 years worth of motion data at our disposal. And so that means seeing the writing on the wall, and Rick gave me a lovely segue into this, means over the last 8 years I've concentrated our efforts to integrate biomechanics with computer science, and in particular to leverage AI approaches such as machine learning, which allow us to sort of bridge that gap, which is somewhat the holy grail in biomechanics, sports biomechanics, where what we really want to do is be able to collect or estimate the high resolution data that we can get in a lab, but do that out on the field. And that's essentially the main focus of our group here at UWA. And so to give you some indication of how much data we have, we and this is with a 50% failure rate, actually, I'm embarrassed to admit, to some of our hard drive over the course of that time. But we have nearly 500,000 motion capture trials available to us, where we've been utilising those in a whole range of sports, but predominantly in gait, running gait and sidestepping, because of the 20-year history we have in ACL research. So we have a number of projects with external partners where we integrate biomechanics, wearables, computer vision, machine learning, with a primary focus to optimise human performance and prevent and mitigate against, I think, injury and disease.
Thanks, Jack. That's fascinating stuff. And Lee, we'd love to hear more from Platypus Technical, and also some of the work that you, I guess the companies that you're working with in your current consulting role, but also in your previous roles with the TGA.
Sure, thanks, Kate, and thanks MTPConnect for the invitation. So look, my background is academic as well, in medical and integrative physiology as well as engineering. So medical and integrative physiology, we're talking about the whole organism rather than a part or something in a dish. And I focused on sensory motor control and neuroscience. So that was how the brain controls our movement, but also how our movement impacts our perception and our brain, and then how that feeds back into performance and health. But then a few years ago, I moved into government, Department of Health, and specifically the Therapeutic Goods Administration, who are our regulator for medical technology. So I had a lot of roles there over the time. I did pre-market work, so that's, I suppose, you think of that as the gatekeeper, and I worked in engineering and physiology there in assessing the products that were coming in. So that's really fascinating. As a regulator, you get to see everybody else's commercial in confidence information. You get to see their designs and the new things that they're working on, and you get to work with them to get that to market and make sure that it's safe and effective. Post-market then is, I suppose, when something doesn't quite go to plan. And I work there as an investigator. So again, you get to work with the companies on their products that are already in the market and delivering outcomes, but for whatever reason, there needs to be a change, or there may have been a complaint, or there's a new feature, or there's a new technology and a new, better way of doing things. And so their product needs to adapt to that when it's already in the market. The other thing I was heavily involved in for the last couple of years was policy and reform. So I was involved with software and computer systems in particular. So the joint venture between the TGA and the CSIRO to write some guidance on cybersecurity for medical technology. That was my project in the TGA. So I led that work on the TGA side. And then following on from that, we've seen, and Kate mentioned it before, the huge amount of reform that the medical device regulation is undergoing at the moment. And I was fortunate to be able to lead the work around software regulation. And more broadly, that includes anything that's programmable. So that's hardware with programmable components or embedded software, as well as all the digital health technologies that we're seeing come out into the world in the last few years. Where I am now, and for the last 12 months, is basically switched to the private side of regulation. So these days I support small and medium medical device companies to navigate all of that, not just the existing regulation, but the reforms that are coming through and the big changes that are underway. So again, I get to work with a lot of companies who have really fantastic technology, and they're trying to bring that to market, often as a startup, but often as a small business who doesn't have the resources of the big multinationals to employ an army of people to deal with the regulator. And then I've still got an R&D side of the company as well, which is applying physiology and human instrumentation to motorsport athletes. So mostly this is looking at physiological and psychological limits and performance within a hostile environment. And that comes back to my background in integrative physiology, where integrative physiologists get fascinated with humans working at their limits, but also humans working in environments that we shouldn't be able to survive in. So we call those hostile environments, but that occurs in motorsport because you're in, so for example, a 12-hour race at Bathurst in February with no air conditioning and a car that's optimized to go fast, not to be comfortable. But you also have hostile environments in workplaces, so people working in mining and those sort of environments where they're dependent on self-contained breathing apparatus or something to keep them alive while they're in that environment. You know, that's really fascinating for integrative physiologists. So that's sort of my research interest, but the biggest part of my business these days is that regulatory component of medtech.
Thanks, Lee. And let's just take a moment to, I guess, share with the audience. I'm going to ask each of you what is one of the cool tech gadgets or devices or enablers that you've been working with, just to, I guess, inspire the audience to give us a taste of, you know, where the future is almost here now, and sci-fi is actually becoming real. Rick, we heard earlier you mentioned this jacket that you were wearing that Catapult has developed. Would you like to tell us a little bit more about that, or is there anything else on your drawing board that you could share with us?
Yeah, look, I think it's a combination of, you know, with wearables, trying to get them as small and unobtrusive as possible. You know, as I said, we built an ECG garment, which collects a really high level heart rate that you know is very comfortable for the athlete to wear. I think because our wearables are also worn in game by athletes, we've always thinking about this, you know, the safety aspect, and you know, kind of making those you know, safe. If you think about an AFL player, or rugby player, someone jumping on top of them, you know, we've also got to think about you know, not only kind of how small we can make it, but you know, how do we make it safe? And then, you know, I think some of the real advances that we've been working on in the last 12 months have been around the analytics. So getting very fine-grained about things that we can detect, and you know, at the professional level, like there's probably 10,000 different analytics that you know we can collect just from the wearable device that we put on the athlete. And just to use one example, I guess, you know, to bring that to life would be, you know, asymmetric loading when an athlete's running, and so being able to detect the load on, you know, the kind of left and the right on the right leg, and then be able to report that, you know, in real time. You know, is one of those examples of those kind of like fine-grained analytics that, you know, we're starting to build into our product.
Thanks, Rick. And Jack, you've got students all over the world working on some really cool stuff in really cool places. Do you want to tell us a little bit about some of that work and inspire us?
Sure. Students are lovely things to have. They always make you look good. And I'm very grateful to have had them, a large number of them through my career. But and they are thankfully distributed all over the world. The bulk of them now working in the wearable space, or with, you know, from Major League Baseball or data analytics actually, so MLB, or across all of the Australian sporting sector in both national sporting organisations. With respect to sort of frontiers of cool tech being developed, I think, wow, probably need to qualify that answer a little to say that it probably any statements I make very much relate to my own biases and my internal evolving definition of cool, as opposed to any sort of broad understanding of tech that's currently being developed. And that predominantly relates to the sheer quantum of tech currently, being developed in the world. It's just almost impossible to keep up with at the moment, and you start to keep well within your own lane. But that said, cool tech for me is definitely tech that seamlessly integrates multiple hardware and software components really elegantly. And specifically for my purpose is any tech that serves to sort of improve the human condition, whether it be physical, intellectual or emotional. And I think an example of that for us is the digital twin project, which is a multi sort of collaborative project across Australia and other international partners, where and just to give a brief overview, where we aim to integrate things like multiple imaging modalities like CT and MRI, etc., fluoroscopy, maybe whatever's available, to start by building a physical picture from sort of cell to shell or DNA to skin of an individual. And once we have the bulk of it, or at least a minimum number of physical assets available to give us some sort of in silico replica or computer simulation of an individual, but then use all of these fabulous wearable technologies that Rick's referring to be able to use that information to monitor that person in the real world back in their digital replica, but also then be able to simulate a whole range of things using that real world information that gives us a much more valid estimate of what's happening for that individual. And we can use that, just to put that in perspective, we could perhaps use that to get a much better understanding of cumulative loads that might lead to OA development in individuals, so we can get some long-term health status and monitor that on people from both perspectives, in the sense that we can get some immediate needs if we're monitoring children and fundamental movement skills and motor development, but we can also track people across the lifespan, and we can do that with an aim to do that across the wider community and more globally. So we go big to fundamentally come back small to then be able to assist the individual. But I think I'd like to finish that by saying I think cool tech also has to be tech that solves needs, not just wants. And I think we're starting to see too much tech being developed with very little validation. There was a paper in 2018 about assessed 100 wearable devices, and more than half of those were not validated through independent research. And in the general consumer market, there's something like only about 5% of technology sold to consumers that's validated. And I think as a core principle for me, and there's a real opportunity in that for the sector. I also sit on the International Society of Biomechanics in Sport Board, and we're looking right now at establishing some white papers and some procedural information for companies, because it's not companies' fault. They're not able to go anywhere currently to find a pathway to validate their research independently unless they can partner up with institutions like mine. But there's a really interesting opportunity, I think, for the sector. So at the end of the day, and as I get older, I think tech that starts to work for the public interest, that doesn't have any hidden trade-offs for the individual, that's what cool tech will be for me moving forward.
Yes, Jack, and that provides a great segue to Lee. Perhaps you could share with us some of the companies that, some of the cool tech you're seeing, but also talk about that, I guess, commercial pathway to getting that tech out of the lab, out of the research, into the market, and how do you balance what regulations are required in a very fast evolving technology and data sector?
Yes, so it's interesting to hear Jack bring up validation, because in medicine that's a requirement, so it has to happen, so everyone does it. If you are marketing as a therapeutic good, when you are marketing as a lifestyle product, you are usually an unregulated product, and that's where we get all these sensors that are making claims that haven't actually been proven. So there is certainly a difference there in terms of regulated products versus the unregulated ones. In terms of which tech gets me excited. My challenge as a regulatory consultant is that I see things before market. And so when I was at the TGA, that's true as well, but you're in a room with another 100 people who are in that position and you can talk to them about it. When you're on your own, you learn about all these cool things, but you can't talk to anyone about it because it's still pre-market. So in terms of my own developments, I've always worked myself on instrumenting people in order, whether it's for sport or for medicine. And so sensors and new sensor technologies always get me excited when they come on the market because I don't have to do that myself anymore. I can buy it from someone else. But the problem I'm hitting these days is everybody creates a sensor and they lock it in their own proprietary way to an iPhone or something like that. But if you're measuring an athlete, you need to measure more than one thing. And so we end up with all these great sensors and I need 4 iPhones if I want to use all of them at the same time. So what's actually exciting for me is the new technologies coming through the pipeline relating to how we network sensors when we stick them to a person. So body area networks is what they're called, but the new technologies that let us throw away wireless are really interesting because although Bluetooth and Wi-Fi and all the low power wireless technologies are fantastic, we're flooding the spectrum and it gets very noisy if you've got 100 sensors on someone. So the technologies that are sending sensor signals through the skin, for example, are exciting because it gets rid of all that noise and lets us network a lot of different sensors. And edge computing is making a comeback. So the cloud has been fantastic for analytics and for accessibility to AI and machine learning. It's been fantastic. But again, you don't always want to be pushing huge amounts of data up to the cloud. There are privacy issues, but there are also issues just around the volume of data you're collecting. So for me, being able to do computing at what we call the edge, so before the cloud, you can do computing on the person within their body area network and start making decisions at that point instead of in the cloud. So for performance, that's important in terms of processing data and only transmitting what you have to. But in medicine and health, it lets you start bringing in decision-making locally without needing to send people's medical data to someone else. And that's really exciting for me. And some of those medical technologies that are coming through that will allow some benefit to patients and clinicians who are having to interpret this stuff. But again, what we're seeing is, and although I said at the beginning that the regulations force people to validate in medicine, what we're starting to see is products that are on the edge of that line. And we're seeing them come from people who don't realise they're making regulated products, and so they don't go through the validation. So what we're seeing is a lot of big claims about what computing and AI can do for medicine and sport from people who don't know how to validate, and in some cases don't realise that they have to. And so that's not a cool tech, but that's a challenge that's certainly associated with a lot of the cool tech that's coming in, especially around products that are making decisions independently without, say, a clinician or a coach coming in. The computer is making the decision. That absolutely has to be validated. And even if it's in a lifestyle or a sport product, a wrong decision by a computer could lose you the game or lose you the race. And, you know, in sport, that's the outcome everyone's looking for. So again, that's a challenge associated with these new techs that are exciting for me, but still a challenge to deal with.
jump in and ask you, of course, you know, MTPConnect is one of the federal government's growth centres. We're, you know, committed to growing the sector and creating new opportunities. And a large part of that is also educating the sector about the commercial pathways and enabling those early stage research projects to get traction. Perhaps, Dan, you'd like to tell us about what's come your way in terms of the programs that MTPConnect is managing, and also what are the future opportunities there for commercialization skills?
Thanks, Kate. Look, I might start by just saying that the cool tech we're seeing coming through some of our funding programs aligns very nicely with today's topic. And the one that comes to mind that we funded through our Biomed Tech Horizons program is the Queensland group Wearable, who are developing microsensors for measuring a whole host of analytes in athletes and patients, which is really going to be quite interesting when they start to work on things like analyzing sweat in athletes. But maybe I can take a step back, because we've talked a lot about elite athletes and everybody's mentioned elite athletes. But for me, the key thing that's happening at the moment is the ability to take technologies and improve wellness and well-being, particularly in a time of COVID. And I bring this up now because I know that a lot of the work that groups like Catapult do allow the training programs for elite athletes to be pushed down to the weekend warriors. And just minutes before I jumped on this call, in fact, I was a bit late getting into the green room, if you like, because my local bike shop phoned me and told me that my smart trainer had arrived after a month or so of delay because of the backlogs. And now in COVID, we've got people who are using smart trainers that you can connect to computer programs like Zwift, and you can actually ride your bike inside your garage or your house, but be virtually transported to France or London. And you can then download training programs that groups like Catapult and others have created based on biomechanics. And so this whole technology, which was originally focused purely on elite athletes, is now finding its way down to the average athlete, individuals. And I think it has a really important role to play in times, particularly, you know, in Victoria, where we're locked down again, we can't get out and about. We are seeing people continuing to focus on their fitness, continuing to work on their well-being and their health, and they're doing that with the aid of technologies and you know, micro wearables, smart technologies, online avatars, training programs that are developed based on huge data packages that groups like Catapult are collecting. So that's really the exciting area for me in terms of at this moment in COVID, seeing some of these technologies being pushed right down to the general public.
Thanks, Dan. It's great to see some questions coming up on our Q&A box. So please, keep them going, and I'll try and grab them as the opportunity arises. But some of the things that we're certainly getting in terms of the questions are around, as to Dan's point, we start off solving, I guess, an athlete's challenge or a performance challenge, but then what's the transferable application? So how we're seeing demand coming from, you know, semi-professional athletes and you know, more sort of popular sports athletes, but also in terms of injury prevention, or even just for general well-being of the population. So we're collecting all this data on individuals that are specialised in one particular sporting field. What's the application, or what's the application of the device that's been developed to make it available to everybody and get more insights into, I guess, the well-being of a population? Does anyone want to speak to that?
I can certainly start.
Yeah.
So I guess what we've seen is definitely that trickle down effect in terms of our product adoption. So initially our products were used at the high ends of professional sport, and now we have lots of customers as well who are, you know, semi-professional or you know, university teams that are using similar but not the same technology, and I'll come back to that. And we also launched a consumer product a couple of years ago, which was targeted just at soccer players. And I think you know, what was touched on and what's really important, I guess, as we move down to serve different customer needs is, really the data aspect of it might be the same and the insight might be the same, but the person who's consuming it is a very different customer. So now you're not talking about a sports scientist, who's qualified and who's able to consume the 10,000 different analytics that we might generate at the kind of high end of the professional level. And so really we've had to think a lot about the experience. And so, at our kind of semi-professional products, it's a much more of a curated user experience. We're probably going to offer, 10 to 20 analytics. They're kind of more simplified. There's got to be a lot more explanation around those. You're not getting into the same level because you're typically talking about one coach who's managing the team and is also interested in looking at the data. You're not talking about a big professional staff who've got specialists. And then when you get down to the consumer level, it's the same challenge again in terms of the user, is really just, an individual. The average age of some of our people who are buying our soccer devices is like 14 or 15. So they're, typically someone who's interested in taking their sport quite seriously. They want to wear a tracker when they train or play and get some insights from that data. But, we really want to bring the benefit of what we know, but we have to think about presenting it in a much different way to the user, because they're not coming from the same background of really having kind of deep knowledge and understanding. So we want to bring all of our insight and offer that to them in a much easier to consume way. But I do see as a trend that if I think about our own business, just that trickle down, typically the professional sports teams will always be at the cutting edge. The bigger teams with more money, right at the cutting edge, and then it trickles down.
Jack, I guess you can, I was going to jump to you. Is this data given to an uninformed person a good thing? Can it be used in the wrong way? And what are the benefits and what warnings there?
I might circle back to that if that's all right, because I think it actually goes to the heart of what Lee was talking about before with validation. I'm not necessarily sure it relates to the experience of the user, but it actually relates to the claims made by those people marketing the tool or the software. I will just answer one. Clearly, there's a question in the chat from James Dunn, and I probably should declare a conflict of interest. I strongly suspect this is James Dunn, who trained in biomechanics here at UWA, went to Stanford for many, many years, and I just saw on LinkedIn he's now moved to Apple as a senior research engineer. So hello, James, and this is a very cheeky question of you. As I see here, in terms of wearables, and it goes back to the original question about the transfer of integrated sensors, etc. We, this year, for the first time in my advanced biomech unit, I asked the students to use machine learning algorithm to try and predict those metrics that we know are associated with, say, development of knee osteoarthritis, or a general consumer problem, based on simply the accelerometer data in a phone. And basically, we trained a model that would actually predict those metrics from known data high-resolution data that we have in the lab that we know is related to OA, and then tried to train a model that would understand that based on or predict that based on just the phone information. And it only works with about 60% accuracy. As a researcher, I think that's pretty bad, but if you compare that to most consumables on the market, consumer products, it's possibly fairly good. I would say that is not anywhere near the level where we would be able to say this is something a consumer should use and it would give you some indication of OA risk. That being said, with respect to James's question about consumer-based wearables like phones and watches and headsets that have integrated sensors, I do believe at some point we will, given enough information, we will, and that would probably though require cascading neural nets or transfer learning through a whole range of models. But I do believe we will end up with some level of in the wild prediction for the consumer that will be useful. That being said, much of it needs to be validated, and particularly as it goes to Janelle's question, as I said, I don't want to go on about validation, but and there's a question from Luke as well about there's no real regulatory standards as I understand it, and I'm happy to be corrected by Lee, regulatory standards, particularly as it relates to data in sport. I know that the Australian Academy of Science and Law are about to have a look, undertake a project that will look at the use of data in professional sport shortly. And I think it's absolutely necessary, because much of the work that we do now could easily have medical implications, as Lee was saying. For example, things like tracking data, in-game tracking data could actually have long-term implications for, say, subconcussive knocks, and that actually has long-term medical implications for that athlete. That ultimately is, in the current space, is entirely unregulated in my understanding.
Thanks, Jack. Lee, yeah, we're certainly getting a lot of questions about TGA, as you can see on the Q&A, Lee.
Yes.
And I guess this is also a much bigger theme than sport. So with the work that MTPConnect was involved in during the COVID rapid response, we saw a lot of companies pivoting to address COVID medical requirements. And I guess even broader than that, we're seeing this boundary of data and sensors coming in to inform clinicians in their treatments and care pathways for patients. So we are seeing a lot of companies that may have not been in the medical space move into this space. And it is a fast learning environment to understand what this thing called the TGA and how might you navigate and commercialize a medical product, very different to how you might commercialize another product. Can you talk a little bit about that? Seeing some of those questions coming up, and when do you need to interact with the TGA? For some of the budding entrepreneurs online.
Yeah, so there are a lot of questions coming through, and Jack and Rick have both raised points that can be touched on as well. So look, I think I need to give a 20-second rundown of how medical device regulation works in Australia. It's very different to the FDA, but the FDA are an outlier internationally, okay? Basically, medical device regulation is harmonised around the world, except for the FDA. That's a simplification, but keep that in mind. There are a couple of questions there touching on standards, and standards are not compulsory in Australia. The TGA Act doesn't require people to use standards. That's intentional because it frees people up for innovation, okay? And it gives manufacturers freedom to do new things because they don't have to stick to this standard that, as good as standards are, they always lag technology, okay? And then this use of consumer grade sensors for medical and high performance applications. Now I have personal experiences with this, and validation is one part of the problem, and we've touched on that already, but a second part of the problem is proprietary information. My own experience with a wearable that I was going to use for a high performance application was, this looks great on the data sheet, but the calibration factors are missing. So I wrote to the company involved and said, hey, look, I want to use this to develop into a component for my own product. Can you publish the calibration factors? And they flat out refused. Now, as a researcher and a developer, it's not actually possible without me validating the product myself to use it if I don't know its sensitivities and its tolerances. So I threw it out and had to pay 3 times as much for the research equivalent. So broadly, that's an issue across health and high performance, because the accelerometers in your phone may be a very good accelerometer, but if Apple or Samsung or whoever's built the thing aren't going to release the calibration factors, using it for sensitive measurements and critical measurements, and when we get into medicine, it is a critical measurement, is not necessarily possible without a huge amount of validation on your part. So that's one of the challenges, and it prevents some of that trickle. I don't know if it's trickle down in this case as much as trickle across into health, but it prevents that in a big way, because if you're making a product using a sensor, but you don't know its calibration factor, you don't know its sensitivity, there's no way you can support a medical claim that would satisfy a regulator. And that is a big problem for startups who are, particularly with MVPs, trying to get something across the line. Janelle's question talks about the line between sport and medicine. And there's definitely a line here. It's an important line to know where it is. And my advice to clients is usually know where the line is and make a decision to cross it when you're ready. Don't fall over it by accident. Okay. So if you're creating a product that you're worried somebody might interpret as a medical product, have a regulatory strategy, even if that regulatory strategy is reading that section of the Act and saying, we're not a medical device because, and writing that down, because then when somebody like the TGA comes knocking, you can prove that you've thought about it. Okay. But Janelle, that concept of sports performance and physiological process, the legislation does mention physiological process, but what's important is your intended use. Now, sports performance is not a health condition. And if I take an example of a physiological performance process being heart rate, there are plenty of lifestyle devices that measure heart rate and make no therapeutic claims, and they're unregulated, okay? As soon as you start making a claim that could be considered to be therapeutic or diagnostic, that's when you cross that line. So Jack's example of concussion is an excellent one, because that device might have been made by the manufacturer to measure accelerations or force or some data for the purpose of the coach or the team using it to win games. Somebody could use that data to estimate concussion rates and which athletes are affected. Now, that use is therapeutic and that use is regulated. However, if the manufacturer of that product doesn't intend it to be used that way, the product is not regulated. Okay, so a third party using your product for medical application doesn't mean your regulated product unless you're marketing it to them with those claims. Okay, and the regulators look at your marketing claims, not just your instructions on the box. Okay, so Janelle, I hope that helps clear it up. It's about the claims you make and the claims you as the manufacturer of the product make, not what someone else is using it for. Okay.
Thanks, Lee. Well, I think
I think I'll stop there.
Yeah, I know we're going to wrap up because clearly, there's a lot to discuss in this very tight 1 hour frame, and it's been a fascinating discussion. I do want to just quickly sweep around and ask the speakers for just some closing remarks for a minute or so each. And I think I'd just like to shift to, we have a lot of people online, no doubt, who are graduate students who are thinking about opportunities for, what are the career opportunities in this space? Are they coming from a medical background or coming from data analytics, and what's the way forward? So I'm just going to sweep around and ask you all in that context. But Rick, I'd just like to quickly ask you, Catapult Sports, who are they employing? Who are you hiring? What's the skill set you're looking for? Just to share with us in some closing statements for.
Yeah, look, I think we have data scientists. We also have partnerships with a number of research institutions around the world. And so that's another, kind of mechanism for, for working in this space. We have sports scientists. We have, our own internal team of sports scientists. And, we continue to talk to, lots of people who are innovating in this field. And, I think there are lots of pathways, lots of exciting pathways to, to commercialization. Within Australia, there's an Australian Sports Technology Network, which lists all of the, different startups that are working in this space. They also have an accelerator program, which I think is really interesting for people who are kind of thinking about commercialization opportunities, which, we're always keeping an eye on as well. So definitely, lots of interesting opportunities to, to work in this space. I think, on the other side, lots of our customers, employ sports scientists and, particularly, I think you mentioned at the top, Australian sports scientists are very well regarded around the world, and lots of our customers who work in NBA or NFL or English European soccer teams are actually, from Australia. So that's a great connection.
Thanks, Rick. And Jack, to your point, you're working with many students, you've trained many students. We've heard about the fantastic program at UWA. Any advice or messages you'd like to leave with some of the people online thinking about a career in biomechanics?
Oh, if you're thinking about a career in biomechanics, bioengineering, then just do it. It's clearly an emerging and growing field. We're highly regarded in this country, across Australia, at many institutions, and in private companies and industry companies like Catapult and Platypus, etc. If you are thinking about doing it, I should probably acknowledge at the outset, I've dropped some biomechanics cognate work from the program that we teach here to replace it with things like Python coding and R and machine learning tools and all those sorts of things. So I think having a wide skill set, not being stuck into high performance sport, because once you train generally in the area, you can actually you can apply those skill sets across a vast array of domains, and you'll easily be able to find work if you apply yourself in not just the biomechanics space, but computer science, data science, etc.
Thanks, Jack. And Lee, before I switch to Dan in the last minute, you must shout out too, you must be working with entrepreneurs and startups with that same broad skill set. Is that something?
Yeah, and actually I'm going to focus on any engineers out there, because there is still a shortage of people with a hard engineering background in the field. And what I mean by a hard engineering background is you might be a chemical engineer or an electronics engineer with no physiology or medical science training. But if you're interested, get involved, because those hard skills are still very valuable. And I think most countries and teams have worked out how to get the best athletes. It's now the engineering that wins gold medals, in my opinion. And I see that when I see the people who win gold medals, and often they have an Australian engineer working for them, even when they're in another country.
Thanks, Lee. And Dan, gold medals can come in sports, but elsewhere as well, right?
Absolutely. Look, Kate, I don't have much more to say other than to thank you for the work that you've done in putting this together and moderating. It's been great to listen to what's happening in the sector. I think there's some really neat tech coming through. I think, touching on skills and job opportunities, it's an area where people can create their own jobs in essence. And I think that's the really exciting thing about some of these smart technologies is smart people, well-trained, can create their own opportunities. And that's what we need to see happening in Australia.
Thanks, Dan. And just in the last minute remaining, thank you, everyone. We will be revealing this as a podcast. And stay tuned for our next webinar on Thursday, 27th of August. Thank you, everybody. I think